Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we're talking about the SAT and ACT and the score kids need to get to have choices for college admissions. So let's get started. My name is Ann Dolan, and for the past 20 years, I've been the president of Educational Connections Tutoring. I started out as a classroom teacher in Fairfax County, Virginia. And over the years, I've seen lots of things change when it comes to college admissions and entrance exam testing. We'll talk about all those things today, but mainly we'll focus on what a good score is and even the timeline for testing. You know, which tests do your kids need to take and when do they need to get started? And then when do they need to take those actual tests and submit them with their application. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about how to improve test scores. Now, along the way, you will have an opportunity to ask questions, and I would love for this to be interactive. So on your panel, you have a little Zoom panel, and there you can enter questions into the chat feature. So please do that, not just at the end, but as we go along. I also have Rochelle on the line with me from my office, and Rochelle is going to help us make this interactive. So she'll read out the questions as you type them in. So let's start out with the PSAT. You know, parents often ask things like, well, when does my child take the PSAT? Does it count? And do I need to prepare? Kids take the PSAT depending on their school at different times. For example, at some schools, kids will take the PSAT the fall, usually October, of their freshman, sophomore, and then their junior year. Some schools, they only take it their sophomore and junior year. So check with your school. We do recommend that kids take it at every opportunity that their school has for it, not to really see or to improve their score, but just to get a feel for standardized testing. Because often these lengthy tests are things that the kids have not experienced before. So the more practice they can get early on, the better. So who sees these scores? Just you. They're never sent to colleges. So that's a good thing, that they're really private information. They really give you an idea of what to expect later on when your child takes the actual SAT. Now, some schools have a practice ACT, but very few. So today we're talking mostly about the practice SAT. So they help to predict to some degree how your child might score in the spring of their junior year, which is when kids most commonly take the SAT. Do you need to prepare? No. I would say for sure kids don't need to spend time preparing unless they're in the running for the National Merit Scholarship Test. So they'll take the National Merit Scholarship PSAT in the fall of their junior year. So unless your child is a super, super high scorer and they're in the running for that, there's no other reason your child really needs to prepare. Unless you kind of have an anxious child who just kind of likes to know what to expect, maybe that student could benefit from a little preparation, but it's truly not necessary for most kids. So what is the testing timeline after the PSAT? First of all, most kids take the actual test in the spring of their junior year. That's traditionally always been the case. And sometimes they'll take it again in the fall of their senior year. But in more recent years, definitely in the last couple of years, we've seen the pendulum swing to where kids are taking it earlier and earlier. So now it's common for kids to take the test for the first time, either the SAT or ACT, and we'll talk about that in a second, in the winter of their junior year. And sometimes kids will even go out for it for the first time in the fall of their junior year. It's not always necessary to do it that early, especially considering your child hasn't had all the curriculum, especially all the math and all the other skills they get from just being in the classroom that early. So what we recommend is that kids take a practice SAT and a practice ACT, not the real test. They don't need to do that. in maybe the summer of their junior year and definitely by the fall of their junior year. We give these in the community all the time, and they're free. And you can go to our website and look at all of the dates we have coming up. And that's ectutoring.com/test-prep/practice-test-dates. And there you can see all the options. So we usually say to kids, you know what, go out and take a practice SAT and a practice ACT. And let's use our concordance table to figure out which test you naturally score better on. Because what we find is kids generally have a preference. Some score better on the SAT, some score better on the ACT, and some there is really no difference. And for those kids, it's really a gut feeling. Which one did they most feel comfortable with? Now, we can also compare their practice SAT, their PSAT, to an ACT. It's not a direct correlation, but if kids are really unwilling to take another SAT or a practice test, then we can do that as well. But it's always really important for kids to figure out which tests they want to take early on, because the ACT now is accepted by all schools, and in fact, more kids take the ACT than the SAT. And this often comes as a surprise to parents because the Mid-Atlantic area, especially the DC area, used to be a big stronghold by the College Board, which writes the SAT, but not anymore. A lot of kids are taking the ACT. They feel that it's more like the questions they see in their classroom. So let's talk a little bit about the differences of both tests. Well, the SAT is viewed as more of a power test. The questions are wordier. Now, there's fewer of them, which is good, but they tend to be dense. And sometimes kids will say, it's just hard to get through these questions. I'm not always sure what they're asking me. Now, these questions require more critical thinking and analysis than the ACT questions, which tend to be a little bit more straightforward. In the math section on the SAT, there's a calculator section, and there's a section with no calculator. And sometimes kids freak out with this because they're so calculator dependent. So if they do end up taking the SAT, they absolutely have to practice with no calculator. There's also an evidence-based reading section and a writing section as well. And unlike years past where kids got 800 points for 3 sections, now it's not like that. Now they get 800 points for math and then 800 points for reading, evidence-based reading and writing, which is now combined. So the total score kids can get now is 1,600, which is back to the way it was when we all took the test back in the day. Well, how about the ACT? Why is this such a popular test these days? Well, a lot of kids say, it definitely feels faster because there are more questions and you have a slightly shorter amount of time to do them. So you're going through it faster. So we call this the speed test. It feels straightforward to students. And what's a big difference in this test is it has math, although it doesn't have a no calculator section. It has reading, it has writing, but it also has the science section. My son, who is actually in a private school, took a practice ACT when was it? About a month ago. And he said, "Oh, Mom, that science section was so hard." And it was interesting he said that because we hear that from kids all the time when they first take the science section. They're like, wow, I thought it would be more like solving equations in chemistry or looking at genetics and biology, but it's not like that at all. It's actually interpreting graphs, and kids aren't used to that type of science. So we find that the science section at first seems really hard to the kids, but with practice, it's more like reading comprehension, and we can boost their scores just by them getting used to it and doing lots of practice questions within the science section. So the total point value is 36 points on the ACT. The essay, there is an essay on both the SAT and the ACT, but it's optional. And it used to be that schools wanted the essay, but now not so much. We still encourage kids to always take the essay, because you never know. You could apply to 4 schools and 3 of them don't care, and then one of them says, I want the essay. So you just need to take it. So let's talk about the timeline. You want to set a date for your very first test, not your practice test, but once you determine which test you're going to take, the SAT or ACT, after you take those practice tests, then you need to figure out, all right, I want to take the test on this date, for example, in April of my junior year for my first test. We often have encouraged kids to take it twice in the spring of their junior year, because if they can get the score they need, then they don't have to take it again in their senior year. We used to see kids take the test for the first time in the spring of their junior year, and then if they didn't like their score, they take it again in their senior year. But my experience has been with kids, they're kind of checked out by their senior year. They haven't really prepped a lot. Over the summer, they've been out of school for a long time, and it's hard to improve your score unless you're super, super diligent over that summer. And it's just hard to predict that kids are going to do that. And so for that reason, we try to encourage kids get all their testing done in their junior year. So the date of your first test is going to be determined by a number of factors. First of all, if you take a practice test with us, we'll coach you into figuring out when your child's first test should be, because there's lots of factors. First is your baseline score. You kind of have to figure out, well, I want to apply to these 3 schools. All these 3 schools want about a 30 on the ACT. I'm at about a 25. That's a huge gap. Although to us it might seem like 5 points, that's not a lot. That's huge on the ACT. So you need to figure out, you need to back it out a lot. So you're going to back that out probably 5 months before the test. You need to have plenty of time to prepare to boost your score that much. And you also have to consider your math level. You know, if you haven't been taking challenging math classes all along in high school, you want to take the test as late as possible, because there's a little bit of trig on the tests, on both tests. So, you know, you want to have as much math packed into all of your curriculum before you take that first evaluation. Here are some upcoming dates that kids should know about. So you got May 5th for the SAT, there's June 2nd, and there's August 25th. And then for the ACT, there's April 14th and June 9th and July 14th. So for the SAT, you know, if your child's going to go for the SAT, we like the May and June dates, although that's not a lot of time in between to get your scores back. It usually takes a couple weeks to get your scores and see how you did and then fine tune things. That's not enough time. So for that reason, you know, kids will sometimes take a May test. They may register for a June test. Sometimes they'll take it, sometimes they won't, depending on their May score. And then if they're diligent, they might take the August 25th test if they're, just say your child's a junior right now. If your child has more time, then you might take an earlier test, like you might take a January test, for example, and then take a spring test. If your child's a junior right now, you have the April ACT coming up, and then you could take the June or the July test. I kind of like the July test. They just added that test actually because kids haven't been out of school that long, maybe a month or so, not even, if they're in public schools. So they have time to relax, but they also have time to prep if they're in town before that July test. You can go on our website and see all of the upcoming ACT and SAT test dates, and that's ectutoring.com. If you just go to /test-prep, you'll see a lot of places where you can find this type of information. So what are the ways that kids can prepare for a test? First, one way is to go to Barnes & Noble or go on Amazon and buy a book and practice independently. And this is a fine way of practicing for kids that are self-motivated. And there are many kids out there that practice this way, and they're just very on top of things, and they're self-motivated, and they want to get a good score. So it's fine if that's your child. Not every child is like that. So some kids need a little bit of more accountability. One step up in accountability would be to practice online. And there are free resources. For example, the College Board, which produces the SAT, has a deal with Khan Academy where they provide free online tutoring. Not tutoring, but you can just practice questions online. Not with a person, but it's, there's some feedback there. The next way would be to take a group class. And a group class would be where there's lots of other people in the class and you're all working on the same thing. And that can be helpful too if all the people in your group have the same strengths and weaknesses that you do, or they're all going at the same pace. And then the other option is to work with a tutor. A tutor is best if you have kind of a different profile. For example, you specifically want to improve your math and science scores, but maybe there's a part of your reading that's already really good. You may not need to work on that so much. What we find is every child is a little bit different, and every child needs a slightly different approach. And when you're working one-on-one with a tutor, the tutor is able to see, oh, you actually in your math section, you're doing well on the algebra parts, but your geometry is really rusty. I'm going to go in that direction with you and prepare you in that way. So a tutor is just a little bit more fine-tuned than other methods. Rochelle, before we go on to ways to improve scores, do you have questions?
Yeah, one question that parents often call about here is, they ask, what type of test should they prepare for? Or, do they prepare for both? That's just a common question that we always get here.
That's an important question, because the answer is they really only need to prepare for one, and for two reasons. One is time. Our kids are busy. They don't have months and months and months, and they don't have a ton of after school time to prepare for these tests. So if you pick one, you're able to condense your preparation more. Secondly, it's stressful. I mean, you've got AP classes, you might have an honors class, you might have an IB class, you're doing extracurriculars, and now you have to study for a test. Well, you're going to have better results, and you're going to be a lot less stressed out if you're just studying for one test and not for two tests. And so for that reason, we've seen kids be a little calmer in this approach and actually improve their scores more because their focus isn't split. They're just focused on one test.
Great. And Anne, what is the test duration, for the ACT and SAT?
I'm sorry?
The test duration?
Oh, okay. Sorry. These are long tests. So both tests are about 3 hours, which is, a good amount of time. And I was actually going to touch on that. I'm glad you brought that up, Rochelle. The ACT is slightly shorter. The SAT is a little bit longer, but both tests require kids to develop their timing. They have to know about how long they have for every question, but they also have to pace themselves. It's kind of like a marathon. If you've only taken short tests in the past of 45 minutes or an hour, taking a test for now 3 hours and 20 minutes is going to feel super long. And so let's talk a little bit about how kids can improve test scores, because that actually is a big part of it. The first is test taking strategies. You've got to be a good test taker. You've got to know the strategies. Little things like process of elimination. How do I get rid of some answers and focus on narrowing it down and then picking the right answers? How do I, in math, if I don't know how to solve this problem, how can I plan backwards? These are simple strategies that, kids need to know when they're taking the test. So it's not good enough just to know how to do it. You have to know the strategies. So the second one is content review. We see this often in math where kids have, they're in these advanced math classes, but for example, they haven't done geometry in a while. So we'll go back and brush up on those geometry skills. Or they're working in grammar in the writing section and they've just never learned some of these skills before. So we'll work on shoring that type of content up. But the third way is simulated full-length practice tests. And this gets to the endurance piece, because you really want kids to practice these tests, not just on test day, not just practicing some strategies and some content and then just going out and taking the test. They really need to sit for a couple of tests in a practice situation. They don't need to go out and take the real test, and feel what it's like to sit there for 3+ hours and go through these problems and know how much time they have for each problem, and then how it feels to sit through a test. You build endurance through doing this. And what we've found is, out of all three strategies, all three ways, strategies, content review, and full-length practice tests, the number one way kids can improve their scores is through these simulated practice tests. And we offer these for free, as I mentioned, all the time in the community. And I really, really recommend kids to take these. So we'll produce this beautiful color-coded score report for anybody that comes out and takes them. And then we'll call the parent up, and often the child is on the line too, and we'll go over with them how they did on the test, where they did well, where they need to improve, and how they can improve. And it's super helpful to kids, not to only to have that information, but just to sit for these tests and feel what it's like. It's kind of like somebody said, it's kind of like running a marathon. You're not going to go out and run just 5Ks, which are about 3 miles, and then all of a sudden run a marathon. You just have to build up. And it's the same with standardized test taking.
Great. And Anne, is the PSAT also 3+ hours long?
No, it's a little bit shorter. So the PSAT is about a half hour shorter because there's no writing section on that test. So they don't have to write an essay on that test like they do on the other two tests. It's also slightly easier because, kids that are in their freshman or sophomore years, they're just not at the same level that the kids are that take the actual ACT.
Right, thank you.
About that. Okay, so now the question is, why does all of this matter? Well, we'll talk about test optional schools in just a moment, but for now, test scores still matter, and they really matter a lot. And you want your child to score to his or her potential. For example, if your child's sitting on the ACT a 24 and they could be getting a 27, that 27 is going to put your child in a whole other ballpark of schools than the 24 is. So these days, when getting into college is so competitive, you don't want your child to just sit on their score and say, what, good job. It's probably good enough, because it could be the case with some practice, they can get up to a whole nother tier of colleges, and you really want them to be scoring at their potential. It's also the one thing that you can control, because here's the thing. Kids cannot go back and change their GPA at this point when they're juniors. They can't go back and now be a leader of a club or be the captain of their soccer team. It's too late, but test scores are the one thing in the application that kids can definitely control. And that small increase can make a huge difference in admission. So let's talk about what a good score is. Well, it really is relative based on your school of interest. In these selective colleges, top factors are grades and are test scores, but there are other factors too. Extracurriculars, recommendations, essays, and for some colleges that have one-to-one interviews, and not many do, but that can also be something that really buoys your application. So what is a good test score? Well, let's talk a little bit about ranges of schools. I'm going to start with University of Maryland because, back in the day, Maryland was considered a safety school, but it's just not anymore. I mean, Maryland is really selective, and they want top scores. So for the ACT, it's between 30 and 33. And for the SAT, it's between 1330 and 1440. Those are pretty good scores, challenging scores. For University of Virginia, for example, the mid 50th percentile of the freshman class was between 31 and 34. And these are all mid 50th percentile scores. So that means for their incoming class last time around, they had scores right about in this range. And when you're interested in finding scores for the school that your child may want to apply to, don't go to these blogs and random websites. Only go to the school's website. Go directly to UVA's website, directly to Maryland's website, and they'll post it all there. For the SAT, it's between 1320 and 1520. So that's a big range. So that means if you're on the lower end of that scale, you need to have killer grades. And if you are at the higher end of the scale, your grades can be slightly lower. Now, let's talk about test optional schools, because a lot of colleges are going in this direction. In fact, almost 1,000 colleges have some type of test optional program. Test optional is when they don't consider your test scores in their admissions decision. But your GPA has to be in a certain range to be considered for the test optional program. So, for example, at George Mason University, which is a local university, in order to not submit your test scores, you have to have what's the word that I'm thinking of? Rochelle, you can probably help me out here. Not weighted. So unweighted, your GPA needs to be between 3.3 and 3.9 in order to just be able to apply and without test scores. But certainly if your grades are high, if you have a 3.9 or a 4.0, something around there, not having test scores isn't going to hurt you at all. But if you have a 3.3 GPA, and there's nothing that helps you to stand out, you don't have great extracurriculars, you haven't done something amazing, then if your test scores are decent, you actually probably don't want to apply test optional. You may want to apply with your test scores because your test scores may bump you up a little bit if they're good. So George Mason was one of the first schools in the area to come test optional. But not every part of not every department in their school is test optional. For example, a lot of the math, science, engineering departments do require tests. So if you're interested in test optional, always go directly to the school's website. At George Washington, for example, it's really competitive, between a 30 and a 33 on the ACT and between a 1310 and a 1460 on the SAT, but that is a test optional school. One of the biggest ones in Virginia, James Madison, just went test optional. And they say, you are not judged one way or another if you do not send test scores. But my experience has been that if your child has decent test scores, that you probably do want to send them along, especially if their grades are not stellar. And then lastly, sometimes parents ask about subject tests. Subject tests are produced by the College Board, which also makes the SAT. And these are tests that are specific to a subject. You may not know about them because many very selective schools will ask for them. For example, Georgetown, they want 3 subject tests. And a subject test is a test specific to, say, math or Spanish or biology or chemistry. And if you're going to take a subject test, we recommend that you take it right after you finish that class. They're given on the same day as the SAT. So if you're finishing math up, you're in calculus and you're going to take Math 2, which is a challenging math subject test, you don't want to take it like if you've taken calculus your junior year, you don't want to take that test in the fall of your senior year because you won't have had it all summer. You want to take it right at the end when school is done, or as close to that as you can. So Rochelle, before we wrap up, any other questions that I can answer, or is there anything that you think I may have left out?
No. You mentioned colleges and, some schools are going test optional and kind of the other things that they take into account. For example, if a student has taken an SAT 5 times, how does a college look at that? Do they look at the highest score or do they collectively look at the scores?
They will look at your highest score. So some of these larger schools that see thousands of applications, they have software that will cherry pick your highest score. Some schools will also use super scoring. Super scoring is when you may, let's say on one date, say the SAT, where it's evidence-based reading and writing and math. You got 2 sections. Maybe on one administration, you did really well in evidence-based reading and writing, but not so well in math. But the other time you did great in math and just kind of the same. So your scores are kind of the same. The second one's a little bit better. But if you could take your highest one from the first test and your highest math section for the second test and blend them together, then you've got an amazing score. That's called super scoring. In many colleges, super score. But the thing is, and so all the kids are like, oh my gosh, super scoring, that sounds fantastic. I'll totally get it now. The problem is that everybody's being super scored. So does it give you a little bit of advantage? Yes, if you have these wild swings where you do amazingly well on this test and amazingly well on this section on the second test. But in general, because everybody's super scored, the playing field is kind of level there.
Great. And for the subject tests for the SAT, are they just, regular? Like, for example, chemistry, is it regular chemistry, or do you recommend that a student takes AP chemistry? And for marker, the sciences for bio and physics?
Yes. Certainly if they have AP chemistry or AP bio, that's even better because these tests are challenging. And so you can pick which is great. You can pick the subject test you want to take. So for example, if you were okay in chemistry but not great, don't take the chemistry test. Only take the test that is your natural strength. Some schools will say, I want a math test and I want a science test, or I want a literature test and I want a math test. They'll have all different stipulations, but we always encourage kids to go to their strengths. And generally kids do have a strength, so they can pick the test that they want to take and submit those scores.
Great. And do you know the difference between the Math 1 and Math 2 subject test? For example, if you have a student who's finishing pre-calculus, do you recommend that they take Math 1 or do they take Math 2?
I would probably have them take Math 1. I don't know the exact nuances of both the tests, but I do know that if you're taking Math 1, your score needs to be pretty high. So go through and look at all of the content in Math 1. Have the student do this. It's better than the parent because the student knows exactly what their curriculum was and what they covered. Go through Math 1 and see if that test is what they're most comfortable with. It could be Math 2, but look at what they've covered because it's a little bit different in each class that they've taken. And you may want to prepare if the college is saying, you need to take a math, because a lot of kids do take Math 1. Your score needs to be pretty high on that. So because it's kind of all encompassing. It's not just like chemistry, which is kind of one thing. There's lots of skills within Math 1. That might be something your child may want to consider preparing for.
Great. And I have a parent who asked, how much do these subject tests cost? And on College Board, it's $26 for the first, it's the registration fee for the first test, which is $26. And for any additional subject tests you take later in the day, it's $21 extra, and $26 for the language test because you have to listen to something.
Oh, that's good to know, Rochelle. Thank you for sharing that. That's good information. And what I would also recommend is anytime you register for an SAT, an ACT, or a subject test, look at the deadlines. We get calls from parents all the time where they don't realize they have to register so early without a penalty for registration. So anytime you're looking at registering your child for these tests, just make sure you do it early.
Great. And the last question I have, Anne, is, why is there a shift from taking the ACT now with kids?
Well, the SAT changed its format a couple of years ago. And when that happened, it was just chaos, to be honest. Nobody knew what was going to be on the new SAT, as it was commonly called. They didn't report the scores for many, many, many months after the first test, and even after the second time they gave this new version. And because there were so many unknowns, kids shifted to the ACT in droves. I remember that year that the SAT changed, we had one student in taking the SAT. All of our other kids were taking the ACT because it was just a sure thing. And what kids found is that, oh, I kind of like this test better anyway because it feels more like school. I understand what they're asking me in the questions. They're easier for me to understand and to give a quick answer. And so for that reason, more kids went to the ACT, and it's just kind of stuck. Although a lot of kids have shifted back to the SAT, we still see a lot of students now taking the ACT.
Great. Those are all the questions we have.
Excellent. Well, Rochelle, thank you so much for sharing that information. I hope this has been helpful to everyone. I want to give you my contact information should you have additional questions. Best way to reach me is email, ann@ectutoring.com. Thanks so much and have a great day. Bye-bye.